Dr. Daniel Cantey, it is such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my God, such a pleasure. You tell me about your educational background because it's very illustrious. It's a little bit much for me to remember.
So I went to undergraduate at Davidson College, finished there in the late 90s, 1999. Before I went to grad school, I was an Army officer for 4.5 years at the 3rd Infantry Division in Fort Stewart, Georgia, which is near Savannah. After that, within a year of getting out of the Army, I did a Master of Divinity at Yale and went to do a PhD at Emory. The PhD was in religion, obviously, with a focus on ethics and society, which is like a cross between sociology of religion and Christian ethics.
Mhm.
And then after that, I got hired at Bethel University, which is a small college in West Tennessee. And I taught there for the next 7 years. So that's my educational and academic background with a little of the military thrown in.
What did you teach at Bethel College or Bethel University?
A lot of Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. My upper level courses included church history up to the Reformation, sociology of religion, social theory. So I taught political theory. It was a mixture of philosophy and religion, Christian ethics as well. I did some Old Testament upper level courses, wisdom and Torah for one, and the prophets for another. And so it was good. I was a generalist there, and I really liked Bethel because it wasn't the kind of place where they expected a ton of publications, which meant that you could take time to develop ideas and toy around with them.
What did you write your PhD thesis or your PhD dissertation on?
The PhD dissertation was called The Freedom of Formlessness,
Mhm.
and it was about the ontological implications of the Protestant experience of grace.
Okay.
Yeah. So, in short, if you think about grace as an experience in which being is gathered, or an experience in which being is scattered, to use the biblical language of gathering versus scattering,
Mm.
the Protestant experience of grace, I argued, is one that is conducive to scattering. In other words, when people experience grace, it doesn't draw them into the church, it actually tends to break them away from the church. Not always, of course, but when you look at various schismatic experiences in the Protestant West, a lot of times they either have to do with the experience of grace or the search for that experience.
And this led you to what is the main topic of the show, and that is we're at the end of freedom. Classical liberalism has run its course. And what do we do now? Do we just try and put the brakes on it now? I mean, it's just endless revolution.
Right.
What's
Right.
happening? The endless revolution is now eating itself alive.
Mhm.
How did this start for you? These questions that led to you to this conclusion. How did it start?
Well, the initial question came out of my military experience.
Mhm.
So again, I was an officer from 1999 to 2003, and at the end in 2003, my military service included a participation in the invasion of Iraq,
Mhm.
which was known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. So ostensibly, on the surface of it, this is a war about freedom. We're
Mhm.
going to go there. We're going to depose this dictator, Saddam Hussein, which we did. We're going to try to institute a liberal democracy. We're going to press that on top of
Right.
Iraqi civilization, as it were. And so when I thought about my participation in this, I was under no illusion that this was some sort of Christian war, or if I had died in combat or something of that nature, that this was somehow for the Christian gospel. I saw it essentially as for freedom. This is what we were fighting for. And broadly speaking, this is what empires do. They go to other parts of the world and try to recreate those other parts as an image of themselves. And that's essentially what we were doing. But the big question for me was, what is this thing that I just risked my life for? I went and I fought for freedom. Well, what exactly is this freedom? Because as a young man and as a college student, I thought that there were things wrong with the world. The world seemed broken. It seemed to have things that were not going right.
Absolutely.
And so our freedom did not seem to be this just unalloyed good, like it was just 100% on the positive side. And then I went and fought for it. And I thought, well, what have I just done? And so, how do I interpret this? I like to be able to interpret things. And so when I went back, and at the same time that I was in the desert, it was there that I decided that I was that I was going to try to go to seminary.
Mhm.
Not to be, I was Protestant at the time, so not to be a pastor or a priest or anything, but just I wanted to be a professor, but I saw myself as being in service to the church.
Which,
And so
sect of Protestantism?
I was in the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America.
Okay.
So I digested a pretty decent amount of John Calvin
Oh,
as a kid. Yeah, I was given this.
you grew
uh,
up in the PCA?
yes, I
Oh.
grew up in the PCA. I was given a copy of Calvin's Institutes and read portions of them
Ooh.
when I was like in high school, and in college. So that was my background. Um, a friend of mine, said to me one time, "It's a long walk from Geneva to Constantinople, man. How did this happen?" And I said, "Yes, it is a long walk. It took a while." So, I came out of that particular camp, but I was asking this question: what is the meaning of freedom through the lens of my religious studies? So I got accepted at Yale Divinity School and went there. And it was there that in my third year, I encountered Martin Luther's pamphlet, Freedom of a Christian,
Mhm.
which became a really transformative document for me because I thought when I encountered it, this is something I have to understand.
Mhm.
This is the basic statement of freedom. It's not a political statement. All that stuff's going to come later with the Enlightenment thinkers. But this is the basic, fundamental religious statement of freedom. So if I can understand what is going on here, if I can understand what is at work here, then I will have a better understanding of how freedom has taken shape over the last 500 years and what exactly, again, it was that I went and fought for.
Mhm.
So this was a big part of my development.
I mean, when you were sitting out in the desert, what was going through your head? I mean, not to distract from the rest of it. I remember in 2003, I had graduated from high school in '02, and I remember watching. Let's see, which year was it that Iraq was invaded? Was it 2003? Yeah,
2003,
2003.
March 2003.
I remember, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
March 2003, and I remember walking. I was going to the local community college. I remember this guy walked in through the sort of a not vestibule, but like entryway. The sign said "No Iraq War," and I told him, I go, "The tanks just crossed the border," and he goes, "No!" like that, and I was just like, I mean, to me, it was just like, this is not going to be a good thing, but like, I'm not going to cry publicly about this.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
was like, I mean, no one knew that it would turn into this just like decade and a half, 2 decade long, yeah, 2 decade long, just absolute disaster.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Just
that we would undo the balance of power in the Middle East and provoke all kinds of unforeseen consequences. But that's kind of the way wars go. I don't know. I don't think necessarily that this is the only war where that's been the case, but it doesn't really make it any better
mm.
to say that.
What were you thinking? I mean, when you were out in how old were you at this point?
24,
24.
maybe 25. I left to the desert. When I say the desert, I mean the Kuwaiti desert,
Yeah.
because we got up to Baghdad in 3 weeks. I stayed there for like a month, and I was part of the advance party back to Kuwait. So I was in the Kuwaiti desert for a period of, handful of months, doing nothing, essentially waiting for everybody else to come back down, and preparing for our movement home was why I went back there early. And I just had time to myself. And I thought, okay, what direction is my life going to take? Before going out to the desert, I thought, well, I'll get out of the army and I will continue with some sort of military, not military, but governmental service. I wanted to be an NSA linguist or something like
Uh-huh.
that. I studied Greek language in college. And so I thought, well,
Ancient Greek?
yeah, I studied ancient Greek in college. I thought I could translate it into, some proficiency in modern Greek
Mhm.
and work for the NSA. That's what I wanted to do. But then I came back from the desert and I thought, no, I'm not going to give my life to the state. I'm going to try to give my life to the church in the sense of being a professor and teaching and writing. That's what I hoped to do.
Wow, wonderful. How did you end up becoming an Orthodox Christian?
A lot of it has to do with my dissertation and the criticism of justification by faith alone
Mhm.
that is involved in that. And hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit more.
Please.
But so doctrinally, I had issues. I had pretty serious issues. If you have a form of grace that tends towards schism and towards the breakdown of things, this seems contrary to me, to the teaching of Christ. And it was just fundamentally, I found it very problematic. And Without going into all of the details of their lives, in the dissertation, I compared St. Augustine and Martin Luther, and St. Augustine experiences grace in the garden, and he joins the church and eventually becomes a monk and a bishop.
Yes.
And so he has this career within the bosom of the church. Martin Luther has an experience of grace, and it eventuates in him breaking from the church and the land of a thousand popes that he did not want, but that has nonetheless flowered in the centuries after the Reformation. And so there's very different consequences for this. And so part of my becoming Orthodox was seeing the problematic nature of the experience of grace, particularly in Protestantism. And at that point, I just had to study the Catholic versus the Orthodox Church and say, well, which one do I think is right? Where do they land on various issues? But in addition to that was the sense that Martin Luther is not a standalone figure. He is
Absolutely.
the culmination of hundreds of years of development within the Catholic Church. And when I say that, I don't mean just the corruption of popes.
Mhm.
There are very well-established scholars. Brad Gregory is a historian at Notre Dame who recognizes this. Well, yeah, of course, the popes were corrupt. I think there's something deeper at work there than just the corruption of popes and indulgences.
Mhm.
And so when I looked at Catholic versus Orthodox, I thought, well, the problems in the Catholic Church are there. And it was almost by default that I ended up Orthodox because I didn't really have anywhere else to go. And so,
How
yeah,
so?
well, I just thought, well, if you're not going to be Protestant, you're not going to be Catholic. That kind of
Oh,
leaves the
I
Orthodox
see.
Church.
I see.
And so I walked into the Orthodox Church for the first time thinking in my head, I was like, well, this is where I'm going to have to be. And, I wasn't one of those people who walked in as just sort of overawed by the holiness of the liturgy. You know,
Oh,
I came from sort of rock and roll praise and worship Protestant church at the time. And so when I experienced my first liturgy, I was kind of like, wow, this is a bit slow, was my experience of it. And so it was one of those things that I sort of had to learn to love over time. I mean, obviously, the longer you're Orthodox, the more you see it as beautiful and conducive to inner stillness and inner communion with God. But at first, that was not my initial response at all. That's on the intellectual level. On the more personal level, I have a daughter who is severely disabled, and I heard well-meaning, devout Protestant folks describe the way of life that is required for salvation as essentially consisting of evangelism and performing well in your calling. Again, this is in a Presbyterian context, right? And hearing that from people that I otherwise liked and respected, who were good people, it just made me think, okay, well, what does that do for parents of disabled children or for those disabled
yeah.
children?
Yeah.
Because if this is how you see salvation, and I'm not trying to throw a blanket over all Protestants by saying
Of
this, it's
course
just the
not.
experience. If you have these as the building blocks of the way of life of salvation, then you're not required or even really motivated to engage with the lives of those people who are suffering.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that's like what extra Christians do, people who are sort of above and beyond, right? This was my experience of it. And I had been, I guess as devout of a Protestant as I could be as a young man and into my 20s. And so realizing this just made me rethink my commitments. And I'll admit there's definitely self-interest involved there. There's personal interest involved there. We have our experiences, they influence where we want to go. But I thought, man, there's a lot of suffering here. And salvation has to have something to do with engaging that suffering. And the practical Christian life has to have something to do with that in a way that is meaningful for salvation, not in a way that comes after salvation.
Yeah, it's not like
So,
well, it's not like you've attained salvation, therefore you're going to, feed the hungry and give drink to the thirsty. And it's like, no, that's part of it.
yeah,
It's
that's
very
part
part.
of it.
And it's
Yeah.
also that there is something salvific about the suffering you are going through,
Yeah.
caring for this child who's completely dependent on you. That those the
Mhm.
joy to be able to care for your child. It's also it's parents who have a child who's disabled. That's they feel sorrow at it. That
Mhm.
there's something redemptive for you about that experience.
Well, when you move into the Orthodox Church, the concept of affliction and the sort of category of experience, if you want to call it that, of affliction is front and center in more than I had experienced in
Yes.
other churches. Like you are going to have afflictions, God is going to use them. You have to deal with them. You have to learn to live through them. I mean, they're not necessarily going to just go away.
Correct.
And my daughter, my daughter's 21 at this point. And so if you have them, it makes sense, just on a surface level, it makes sense to be in a church where, the fathers, the practice, the rhetoric, all of it is oriented towards the importance of this experience, as opposed to it not being part of that experience. So on the personal level, I think that was definitely a big part of it as well, because it took several years for me to get dislodged out of the Presbyterian church. I was a pretty hardcore Calvinist as a high schooler, for better or for worse, I guess. I was more theological probably than I should have been at the time. But yeah.
Well, the experience of suffering, it moves you. It causes you to rethink what is important to you, and then to like, what is the purpose of suffering?
Yes. Yeah, it reorients you because it doesn't go the way you want it to go. I mean, you want it to end. And really, the hard part about suffering is the duration. If the hardest thing, if you imagine, like, say you had just like really, really awful stomach cramps. Well, if they're gone in an hour, then, that was miserable, but now it's over and you can get on with life.
Yeah,
But if you've got a suffering that's going to go on for years, if not decades, you have to battle all of the interior temptations that you now have to deal with, and all of the emotions that you're saddled with that don't just disappear because you want them to. And the idea is to be at peace, to rest in God in the middle of that,
correct.
which is really the hard part, and takes time and practice, I think.
Well, and that's another part of your thesis is rest.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. My idea is that if we are coming to the end of the development of freedom, if freedom is what it is essentially that has reached its end, then we as Christians have to figure out from our end what exactly is society to be about, and what exactly are we to strive for. And in the back of this, there's a book by Patrick Deneen, another Notre Dame scholar, Catholic guy. The book is called Why Liberalism Failed. It's a very good book. It's focused on the liberal tradition as a political tradition. Why did liberalism fail? And it turns out that liberalism, which is supposed to free people, freed them so much that they're no longer virtuous.
Yeah,
And so you can't have a good society if you don't have virtuous people. But the more free you make them, the less virtuous they tend to be. So it failed because it succeeded. And so Deneen does a pretty solid job analyzing the problem, describing it. I think it's a good book. I mean, I taught it in social theory a couple of times. But he doesn't ask the question, well, what comes after freedom? I mean, if freedom is reaching its end quickly, if we can't get more free than we are now, then the possibility of downloading our minds into computers or whatever else has happened. I mean, artificial intelligence, transhumanism or artificial intelligence is a really fascinating development in this direction. But if we can't really get further than that, then where do Christians go? And my answer to that, my suggestion, is a rediscovery of what is actually there in the scriptures, which is that rest is holy. And so you go back to the idea of rest, not merely as something that, say, you practice on Sunday, although of course that's one of its basic expressions, but you also see it as a social principle, or you see it first and fundamentally as a religious principle. A way of experiencing God is to rest in God as a practice, not just as an ideological mentality, but as something you are doing.
as like
right?
actual hesychia.
Yes, actual prayer, meaning that learning from the fathers and under the guidance of your spiritual father or your priest, you are learning how to sit in stillness in prayer, to take the time to do that. And the challenge in this, in my opinion, is that's before us here at this point after the digital revolution, is phrased in terms of a question. The question is, are we going to be creatures of infinite possibility?
Mhm.
That is the infinite possibility. Are we going to experience the infinite, or are we going to be infinite possibility creatures?
Could you
I want to
explain what you mean by
I want to
that?
say that. I want to say that. Make sure I say that the right way. Are we creatures who have the possibility of the experience of the infinite, or are we creatures of infinite possibility?
I
The
see.
the possibility of the experience of the infinite is the experience of God. Like God is the infinite, right? He is beyond the finite. And by doing that, we are obedient to the law and we have a life of prayer and sacrament, right? Prayer and Eucharist. So that's the possibility of the infinite. Are we going to have that? Or are we ourselves going to be infinite possibility creatures,
Mm,
which means that we can do anything, hyperbolically speaking, right?
right.
Anything beyond the capacities of human experience as it was traditionally known and known before technological advances. So, which are we going to choose? Are we going to be infinite possibility creatures and be creatures who can say, get on the internet and see absolutely anything at any time, or know absolutely anything at any time? Because this is really what the internet does for us,
Right.
among other things. It's open to us this just vast array of knowledge and
It's
experience, although
overwhelming.
yeah, it is overwhelming. But are we going to be those kind of infinite possibility creatures, or are we going to be creatures oriented towards the possibility of the experience of God?
Yeah.
So it's just a different way of putting that basic question. But that's where we are now, in my opinion. And our range of experience is so broad that it is difficult, at least it's difficult for me, to imagine a range that is substantially broader. Right? After the digital revolution, are we really going to take our infinite possibility of experience on YouTube or just on the internet generally and add another infinite on top of that?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure how we would do that.
Yeah. I don't even know.
Yeah,
Like,
what would that even look like,
yeah.
right?
I mean, like flying cars is not the type of jump that the internet has been.
Right, right. And the thing is, you may think I'm taking it a bit too far, but I already see cars as like low level flying machines.
Yeah.
Just imagine them versus walking,
Yeah.
right? So if you were to walk somewhere, um,
Flying with
and
tires, basically.
flying with tires is essentially what it is when you compare walking or riding a horse or having a carriage or whatever there was before these engines. Now there's just this exponentially large possibility when you talk about vehicular travel. And part of the argument that I make, to get it back to the theology here,
Mhm.
part of the argument that I make is that our experience of the automobile actually has a DNA that resonates with the experience of justification by faith alone.
Oh, what's
And
that?
I know that like that's jarring, right? It's jarring to say, hold on a minute. Like you actually think there's a theological principle that has something to do
Well,
with the experience
I'm
of the automobile?
intrigued. I'm
Yeah.
intrigued.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of intriguing, right? So, okay, there's a lot of steps to the argument.
Well, let's start at the
On
first.
the well, okay, on the surface, let's imagine the modern world as a form of salvation.
Okay.
Okay, as in a form of escape from death,
Uh-huh.
but also of escape from the body.
Uh-huh.
Okay, that there's a fundamentally Gnostic impulse in in the modern world.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so imagine that natural law, the law of nature, which, according to both the East and the West in the patristic era, is written into us, in my opinion. I would make that argument. Okay. You see it, I think, in St. Augustine, and you see it in the Eastern Fathers as well. Obviously, the Eastern Fathers talk about theosis, but embedded within theosis is this realization of the moral way of life that God intends for people. Okay. So there is a law that God has implanted within each of us that is oriented towards life and particularly towards life in Him.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, that law, in my opinion, includes both a mental life that is oriented towards Him and a physical life. We're
Mhm.
supposed to do certain things with our body. Our body actually embodies the law of God,
Mhm.
the moral law of God. Imagine that law was somehow radically perverted so that instead of being seen as something good and something oriented fundamentally towards life, although stained with sin and now punished with death, right? That law has become something tyrannical, something oppressive, a burden that needs to be escaped. Okay, so imagine that within you. right? And imagine that within each one of us, there's two parts, as it were. We become bifurcated, okay? One part of us embodies this law that is essentially like the law of the Pharaoh, okay? That it's not supposed to be there. The other part of this bifurcated nature that we're talking about is the part that yearns for liberation, that its destiny is to be liberated from the harshness of that natural law, okay? And I'm going to step back just a little bit here. This is what I think happens to the doctrine of God within the doctrine of justification by faith alone. If you read Martin Luther, you've got God the lawgiver, and the law is this oppressive, tyrannical thing, and there's the holiness of God, and Luther's sort of, his knees knock at the holiness of God, and the righteousness of God really is the technical term for him. And so there is this figure who just inspires fear, if not terror, as a lawgiver. And the function is really on the law a little bit more than the character of God. When you get to Calvin, the emphasis is squarely on the character of God, not so much on the law. But they're sort of two sides of the same coin, right?
Okay.
So you've got this, near Pharaoh kind of experience, right? Like you're in Egypt under this horrible law. And then you've got Christ the liberator. And so the grace of Christ is the one who liberates from the same law that God himself has given. And so I would make the argument that in the buildup to Luther's experience of justification by faith alone, you have this bifurcation within God. You have the part of God that you really don't want to experience, that basically as a lawgiver and through the law puts the person in hell. And there's really no equivalent to this that I'm aware of in the Eastern tradition. The fathers never talk about the law this way.
Correct.
This is the result of a few hundred years of development of canon law in the late medieval West, from the 12th century up to Luther in the early 16th century, right? So law transforms, it becomes a suppressive thing. And so now you've got this bifurcation within God. But because the law is natural law, not just divine law, but natural law, they're essentially the same for Luther. And again, I would make the argument this is a law that's embedded within us. I think that's the patristic view. What this means is that the law that is within us has become the oppressive thing. So we become bifurcated the same way that God was bifurcated. And what this means is now that salvation is a function of our liberation from that law, which means first and foremost, and this is really a liberation from rest. It's a liberation from rest in God, liberation from rest in the neighbor, liberation from rest in the natural world. But think about it this way. If you've got this oppressive law that is part of human nature, and part of that law is embedded within our bodies manifested, right? And then you've got the part that yearns to be liberated and whose destiny is to be liberated. In fact, understands grace as this liberation. And we're outside of the church here, okay? We're just talking about social order in general and about modern experience. Salvation becomes a striving against the oppressiveness of the law, okay? And when we think about early modern technological developments, I don't know of folks out there who are saying, "Oh my gosh, our bodies are this awful prison and we have to escape them and it's so miserable." They weren't focused on that aspect of it. But what they were focused on was the sense of optimism of scientific progress. That a better world could be created. There was a new emphasis on reform and discipline, particularly in Calvinist countries, right? A new emphasis on reform, discipline. This is when the liberal order was being developed. This is when scientific advances were being pushed towards, right? So there's this new sense of discovery. And not all of this obviously happens under the shadow of the church. There's just sort of a general social movement in this direction. So the emphasis is on the sense of liberation, and the sense of possibilities, and a new world being born, and a new meaning for what it is to be human, a reform of human nature. It was already there in the 17th century, right? So what you have is the DNA for a form of salvation that means liberation from bodily constraints. And when I say liberation from bodily constraints, I'm not talking about, immediately like, sexual impulses. That's a post-sexual revolution thing. That's the last 60 years. What I mean is the confines of space and time.
I mean, from here, it sounds like getting into like transhumanism almost.
You'll get to things like that eventually, but at first, it's a matter of being able to do things that are not subject to basic categories of bodily experience. Okay? So what you're doing when you think about riding in an automobile, right? You sit in the car, your body is totally at rest, relatively speaking. You don't have to walk, you don't have to exert yourself. And so categories of space and time are being nullified, if not overturned, when you turn that key and you can go 200 miles in 3 hours.
Yeah.
And so what you have is a machine that does all of the work, whereas the body does none of the work. And so you have the infinite possibilities of where you can go. When I say infinite possibilities, again, that's relative to how far you could walk in a day, or ride your horse, or ride your carriage, or whatever you may have, right? Very, very limited sense of existence. When you compare that to the speed of any automobile, I had to drive here today from LA. I went pretty quick.
How was the ride?
There's a lot of cars on the road. It's Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah.
So it was busier than I thought it was going to be. Yeah.
Was it scenic though, from LA to Las Vegas?
Yeah, it was beautiful.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a very
yeah, for Southerners like myself, it was very nice. It was very nice.
Very quiet, very meditative.
Yeah, very meditative. It was very peaceful. So I'm living through the things that I'm telling you about at this point. I participate fully in them. It's really hard not to. So in any case, imagine getting into your automobile as a form of salvation that is liberation from this oppressive law of nature, which has its theological DNA in the doctrine of justification by faith alone. But it gets better, because in the doctrine of justification by faith alone, Luther says, person has to come under this horror of the law, the terror of the law that scares them into believing that they can do nothing of themselves for their own righteousness, their own salvation. And so the solution in the experience of grace is that Christ takes on the burden of the law, right? There's what there's what Luther scholarship would call the transfer. The idea is that all of the grace and the kingship and the joy and the peace of Christ goes to the believer, whereas the believer's burden under the law goes to Christ, right? So things get switched up, right? Well, what happens in the experience of the automobile is that the burden of the natural law that would be experienced as oppressive is switched onto something else. And that something else is the engine, which does all of the work. And so the machine literally becomes the avenue of salvation, because it is the infinite worker, right? It is the thing that runs without stopping, right? It suffers what I would call the limitless burden, the burden without rest, right? We expect the machine not to rest. Okay.
Wow.
So the machine, and we have a world filled with machines now. We live according to machines. There are sociologists, I can't remember who said that the house is a machine to live in. I wish I could remember. I wish I could remember who said that.
If you know who this is, write it in the comments.
Yeah. I can't remember who it was who said that. The house is a machine to live in. Not a Christian who said that. But the idea is that the machine becomes the avenue for salvation because it continually takes on the burden of liberating ourselves from our own nature. Okay? So just as Christ takes on the infinite law, it takes on the burden of the law for Luther under this doctrine of justification by faith alone, we've created a world in which our own infinite burden, our own, burden under the oppression of natural law is shifted onto something else, which becomes, again, our vehicle, for lack of a better word here, our vehicle for salvation. So we are saved. We are taken away from suffering, and suffering essentially means experience of the body, like, unwanted experience of the body. Our salvation becomes this form of experience that in which we are liberated from these things, and the machine takes the place of Christ. Right?
I have a question.
Sure.
You had mentioned earlier rest in God as Hezekiah, right?
Mhm.
The experience of the monks seeing the divine light of the Jesus prayer. Now, a few moments ago, you mentioned rest in our neighbor.
Mhm.
I believe it was rest. You said rest in our neighbor, rest
God,
in
the neighbor, and the natural world.
Natural. What would be rest in the neighbor versus rest in the natural world versus rest in God?
Okay, rest in God, I would first say as the Jesus prayer, particularly the prayer of the heart, which for anybody who's watching this, I think the prayer of the heart is absolutely crucial for Orthodox practice and for being in the presence of God. I don't recommend that you actually start to practice it unless you are under the guidance of a priest or spiritual father. It's the kind of thing where you may have experiences and you need someone who is wiser and more experienced to be able to adjudicate those experiences for you. But it is a practice of stillness that I had frankly never heard of, much less experienced before becoming Orthodox, 13 or 14 years ago. It's something that, again, has to be done under guidance, but it's absolutely clear. If you're going to me at least, if you're going to rest in God, it has to be through this practice, in addition to through the practice of the Eucharist and going to worship. Right. So this is absolutely critical. When I think of rest in God, I think first and foremost of prayer. Okay, as something you do, right? And Orthodox prayer, for those folks who are not in the church, it's different. I read Knowing God by J.I. Packer when I was in high school as a Calvinist and thought that I would model my prayer life off of that book, and the way that it talked about the character of God. This is totally different. It is a totally different practice. It's a totally different interior orientation. It's a totally different disposition. But again, you have to learn it, and it takes time. It takes patience. So I would start there. As far as rest in the neighbor, let's talk a little bit about Genesis 2 and what this looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So in Genesis 2, God sees Adam in the garden, and he's given Adam a task, till the garden and keep it. Then he says to him, it's not good that the man should be alone. I'll make a helper for him. Now, many of the fathers interpret Adam's tilling and keeping the garden as kind of interior spiritual work, like work of prayer. Obviously, I'm in agreement with that interpretation. I'm going to provide another one that I think both of them are fine. I think they're both well within the bounds of what is acceptable for orthodoxy. But let's just say that when God looks at Adam and says, it's not good for the man to be alone, I'm going to give him a helper, it's because the amount of physical work that he had to do was something that made his rest in God precarious, okay? Or put it a little bit in jeopardy. The idea being that if you work too much, you can't rest spiritually. And it's not that his rest was taken away, but there was a kind of threat to it, okay? And I want to give a couple of helpful comparisons here for this particular interpretation, all right? So the phrase "not good" only shows up a couple of times in the Old Testament. It's not a very popular phrase. In one of those times, David has gone into the camp of Saul when Saul is trying to kill him. And you may be familiar with the story. He goes into Saul's camp, Saul's asleep, and his David's brother, his comrade in arms, Abner, I think it is right there. And he says, now's your time, strike the king and kill him. And David says, no, I'm not going to do that. Far be it from me to raise my hand against God's anointed. Takes a spear in his water jar and he leaves. Okay. And so a little bit later on, Saul has woken up, sees that his spear and his water jar are gone, right? And so David is far enough away that he can yell to him. And he says to him, he says to Joab, who's Saul's guard, he says, Joab, the thing that you have done is not good, because you were supposed to be guarding over your king and you did not do so. And the argument here is that, well, Saul was at rest, but his rest was in jeopardy. And that's what makes this not good. Okay. There's an even better example, though. That's one example. The other one comes in Exodus 18, which I have always been fascinated by this little story. This is the story where Moses is judging over the people of Israel. Okay. And so the people are coming to him night and day, and he is judging all of their cases. And his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him. And he sees what is happening. He sees all the people sort of lined up for Moses' judgment. And again, like this, it seems like such a mundane little story, right? Like, why is this in the scripture? But here's what Jethro says. The first thing he says to him, why do you sit alone judging the people of Israel night and day? In other words, why are you alone doing this? It's not good for you to be alone doing this.
Ooh, I like that.
Right.
Okay.
All right. Why do you sit alone? Surely you are going to wear yourself out and the people with you. Right. And so the idea is that Moses is working too hard. He is going to have no rest. The people are going to have no rest. And I want to underscore here, the scripture says rest is holy. So this shouldn't surprise us that we see it in these stories implicitly. So just as, God comes to Adam in Eden and says, it's not good for the man to be alone, I'll make him a helper. A little bit later in Exodus, Jethro comes to Moses and he says, "Why are you doing this alone? Everybody's going to get worn out with you doing this." It's a very mundane lesson,
Yeah.
but it's like eye-opening to us because we like to read the scriptures as 21st century people as if the social lens or even the moral lens has to do fundamentally with freedom and slavery. It doesn't have to do with those things in the scripture. It has to do with the distribution of burdens and work and rest, right? You're burdening yourself too much here. And so what does Jethro say? He gives the like very mundane common sense advice. You need to get yourself some helpers.
Yeah.
Right? They'll take care of all the small stuff. You take care of all the big stuff. Right? But then what he says is, once you do this, like you will have rest and everybody will return to their place in peace, which is an adequate description of Genesis 1, where God creates all these different spheres and then he populates all the spheres, right? So, for example, in day 2, he creates the sky and the seas. And on day 5, he puts the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea. So he makes the place and then he puts the things in their appropriate place. And they're at peace in their place. That's what it means, among other things. That's what it means for it to be good. And so when God sees Adam in the garden and he says, "This is not good," it doesn't mean that he's created something that's not good. What he sees is that there is some level of threat to Adam's being in his place in peace, which is what he is made to be.
I like that.
Right?
I like that.
And so Exodus 32, this otherwise, mundane and kind of, I don't want to say forgettable, but it's kind of forgettable compared to the first 15 chapters of Exodus where you have, where you've got the plagues.
There's an angel, there are plagues.
Yeah,
there's
it's
like
all kind of
a
like
lot of river. It's like, wait, why is this story about like a father-in-law who's probably like, look, my daughter is furious. You got to like get some help.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's a very mundane kind of
I
story.
married my daughter to you, and you cannot figure out how to be in the tent with like.
Exactly. You're wearing yourself out. Your wife's like, "Where are you? You're working too hard." So in any case, God makes the helper for Adam, right? God makes the helper for Adam. And what is Eve's purpose? Right? Eve's purpose is to ensure Adam's rest.
Mhm.
That's why she is there. Now, there's more to it than that. I would say that both Adam and Eve are under the burden of work, which is not incredibly burdensome prior to the fall, right? It's only after the fall that you have thorns and thistles. Prior to the fall, you have work, but it's only after the fall that the earth, revolts against them.
It says in the Hebrew says amar veshamar, to work and to toil.
Exactly. Yes.
To work and to what's shamar is shamar like to tend to.
Yeah, to work to till and to keep, or to work and to tend, right?
Do you know about that phrase where it appears elsewhere in the Bible?
No, where else?
It only appears elsewhere in the Bible to describe the work of the priests in the temple.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because Eden is a temple.
Yeah.
Adam's a priest.
Yeah. Okay.
But that phrase Amar Veshamar,
it shows up
only shows up in those spots.
Okay. So Adam and Eve are in the garden, and Eve is created so that Adam could have rest. Mm-hmm. But there are broader implications. The first is that they are both under the commandment to till and to keep. Right. I would argue that the commandment to be fruitful and multiply is built into them. Like it's part of our ontological reality that we are oriented towards life in the ways that God intends. Right. I would also argue that the idea of rest giving is reciprocal. So it's not just that Eve is created to give Adam rest, but they have a joint task, a joint way of being that's supposed to have a joint orientation towards life. And Adam just as well is supposed to give rest to Eve. Okay. But what this means is that now human relationships take on a fundamentally different structure than what has been presumed in the society that has been built around us. What this means is that when I look at you as my neighbor, you are at once a law to me and a source of rest to me.
What do you mean by a law to you?
What I mean is you are a creature of God, and this is just my interpretation, right? You are a creature of God who is supposed to be oriented towards the life of God. And my obligation is to assist you in that orientation.
I see. Okay.
Right? So you remind me of my own obligation to live as God would have me to live. You also give me rest on my path along that way. And you assist in the easing of my burdens, right? Love is defined in the New Testament as easing the burdens of others. And this idea, again, of distribution of burdens, and it's a fundamental idea, I think, in the scriptures. But what this means, again, is that you are a law to me And you are also a source of rest to me. You're supposed to be one or you're supposed to be both in balance. And I am a law to you. I place certain obligations on you by my very existence. And those obligations aren't bad, they're good things. At the same time, that I am a source of rest to you. And we're supposed to live together in harmony, harmony being the balance of this sense of work and rest. Compare that for just a moment to the Enlightenment state of nature. Where does society come from according to Enlightenment thinkers? And Hobbes is the easiest one. I'll admit he is the one that is most conducive to my purposes. Okay,
Yeah.
because his state of nature is the nastiest, right? The other ones are not so good, but his is the worst. Where basically everybody's just at war with each other. They're all these rapacious, selfish creatures who are taking whatever they can get.
Yep.
And what that means is that when I look at you, I immediately see you as an oppressor,
A potential,
or in fact, one or the other,
yeah.
right? You're either a potential oppressor or you're an oppressor in fact. And my idea, my salvation, quote unquote, is to be liberated from you. The only way that I can find balance in my life with you is for both of us to hand over our inclinations to kill to the Leviathan, right? To the great power, right? To the great governmental power. That's not a happy or in any way a biblical understanding of how human social relationships are to be formed. So when I see you, I'm supposed to say, child of God.
Mhm.
I'm supposed to say, created in the image of God, meant for realization of your life in God, for theosis. I'm also supposed to say that you place a burden on me to assist you towards that, right? At the same time that you are supposed to give me rest, right? You look at me that way. You see me as giving you rest. I see myself as giving you rest. So instead of saying you are an oppressive law to me, my salvation is to be liberated from you. You wonder why people are so lonely today.
Yeah.
Why are people so disaffected? And obviously, like the internet plays a role, but it's a tool. And people have been talking about alienation. And Marx talked about alienation and furthered it in very significant ways.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
To say
very
the
significant
least.
ways.
Yeah.
And so, people have philosophers have been talking about alienation for a long time, but it's hard not to talk about alienation when the presumptions of your social life work along the fact that you're basically just an oppressor in waiting to me, and I'm just an oppressor in waiting to you.
Correct.
And so the idea is that we have to be separated from each other. Give yourself a few hundred years of that and see what the result is. Tie it together with some technological development that makes it really easy for any one of us to sit in our rooms and stare at screens all day long. And you just got this recipe for a deeply atomized and alienated society.
Yeah.
And not to mention the fact that when we look at our relationships are entirely voluntary, which is not, always a bad thing, right? But I'm not bound to you. You're not bound to me. Right? We've done away with all of that binding, right? We found all of that oppressive. And even our experience of family is a lot of time very strained by people moving, and let's be honest, right? It's hard to be with people sometimes. People gossip. I'm not saying family members per se. I'm just saying people who are close friends with you. People gossip. People talk smack. You trust people, and then they do stuff behind your back. And then you have to forgive them if you're Christian. You have to figure out what that means internally, not to bear them malice. So being with people can be difficult, but if you are going to achieve the balance of work and rest, or the balance of burden and rest that we're supposed to have, that is our joint salvation as a people, you have to work through all of that. You can't just say, you know what, folks are bad, like Hobbes learned after the end of the English Revolution. The period 1649 to 1651 was utter chaos in England. He published Leviathan not long after that, right? So it's almost like he had lived through a religiously inspired state of nature. I wouldn't. I don't think that's very far from the truth, but seriously,
You've recognized the patterns.
yes, yeah, there it is.
There's some patterns to acknowledge.
Right, but if the answer is, let's liberate ourselves from one another, and people have been doing that for the last few hundred years,
Uh-huh.
Especially since I would argue it, especially since the sexual revolution, you just all this stuff has been just intensified, right? Now you've got children and grandchildren or great grandchildren of the baby boomers, and they've suffered. They're on the end of these successive levels of liberation, right? Because And the presumption that we don't even see, that we don't realize is there is, well, gosh, if I had somebody whose job was to tell me what to do, they would just oppress me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
they would abuse me.
so I just did a live stream this morning on the problem of dating in the church. And basically the problems of dating in the church are more or less the problems of dating in the secular world as well.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. You bring in people from the secular world, this is gonna happen. And the issue was typically that the males and the females are terrified of each other. They view
Mhm.
the women go, well, the men will just oppress me and I'm a victim.
Mhm.
The men go, well, I've just been oppressed by the gynetocracy, so to say, and I have no hope, and I'm not 6 feet tall. I don't have a six pack. I don't make six figures. I have no hope whatsoever.
Right.
And it's that same like there's no rest, as you're putting it. There's no looking at one another as complementary to one another.
Mhm.
You watched as you came in how my wife and I worked together to make food and do things. And there's a reason why with Gen Z, you see like in the social hall after church, the single guys sit way over there, the single girls sit way over there. They have absolutely no sense of working together in a partnership. And something like when I was in high school, even in university, I had just friends who were females, just friends. Just,
Mhm.
hey, what are you doing? You know, Andrew and I are running by. What do you go? Oh yeah, we'll come down.
Mhm.
Just we're all gonna drink coffee and an hour later. I mean, you just don't see that with these kids at all.
Well, there's not that that assumed social expectation that people have to fit together in certain ways. Like there's nothing forcing people to be together. Again, like they're liberated from each other, right?
Well,
And so,
their attitude is like either I enslave them or they enslave me.
yeah, yeah, and
Is
there's
really the attitude with them. It's
mhm.
extremely dysfunctional.
And it ends up pushing groups apart from each other, right? I mean, if you're, and this is going to be kind of, I think, a stereotypical example, but if you believe in various strands of feminism and you think patriarchy is the worst thing that ever happened, then you think having a husband means being oppressed, unless it's a husband in a particular way, right? A husband who
Absolutely.
is completely like washed their hands of anything having to do with male headship or whatever. Which of course male headship can be abused, and there are folks who misinterpret that. But the
They turn into
idea,
a dictatorship,
right,
not leadership.
right, but the idea is that the roles themselves have become, just automatic avenues for oppression, right? And so you look at the other person and you say, not how do I find a balance that is love with this person, but how does this person not oppress me?
Yep.
Right? How does this person not take from me, essentially? Because the fear is that the person's going to take from you.
Oh, that's from the boys. It's like, well, women are just going to divorce you and take everything and ruin your life.
Yeah.
And the girls are, well, men will just oppress you and control you. And they're all, it's like, I mean, I mean, where do you go socially from that?
I I don't know that I could tell folks in their 20s or 30s exactly where to go from that. It's a very difficult question because I think socially, again, our you know our institutions, our means for people coming together, they're they're vociferous. They're weak and they're broken, right? They have all the power of the king and the queen of England to actually rule the country, which is just very little. They're there, but they don't do anything. You know, so it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate.
I mean, what do you do? Do you tell people who are in their, 20 to 30, you guys are so broken, we just don't care anymore. Just shut up and go to church. We're gonna try and raise the next generation correctly. Or do you go, okay, um, this is a complete disaster and we're gonna try and make the most of it and make it work in some way, shape, or form? Now, to me, the answer is the second one.
Yeah, and I think part of what I would say, and I'm not real sure how comforting this would be to folks, but it's two things. It's pray, like learn to pray, and fix yourself. Make yourself marriable. Um, I had a discussion once or recently with my son who was 13. We were talking about marriage, and it was like, well, okay, how do you have a marriage that lasts? And I said, the first thing that you need to worry about having a marriage that lasts, or why people have marriages that last, is that they make themselves into people who are capable of long-lasting marriages.
God, imagine that.
Yeah, make it. I mean, obviously he's 13, so it's not his time for that just yet. But you have to say, well, what does it look like for me to be somebody who is capable of this? Like, what do I need to do? Pray that God will give you the person that is right for you, and God willing, he will, and be patient with that. But at the same time, work on yourself. The idea that I've seen in movies, in Hollywood, is marriage is great because I found this person and they love me for all my flaws and, all the things that are wrong with me, they still love me. Yeah, that's fine. Sure. But you've also got to work to be lovable. You've got
Yeah.
to love that other person despite all of their flaws. You've got to be forgiving. Being married to somebody is learning your own faults and them learning your faults. You learn, what's wrong with them as well. But then you say, you know what? I forgive you and I see all the good things about you and I'm grateful for you. After however many
Absolutely.
years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you say, you're still a blessing to me, more than a blessing to me. And it's definitely the grace of God to have that kind of experience after so many years.
And come to speak of it, this June, it'll be 15 years my wife and I have been married.
And
She's
congratulations.
thank
Yeah.
you. She is still a blessing to me. She's more of a blessing to me now than she ever has been. She's always been a blessing to me. So yeah, it is. I mean, my wife and I are two people who we find rest in one
Hmm.
another.
Yeah.
Going back to that we find we work together, and it's. I mean, marriages are hard.
Hmm. Yeah.
Being married to someone like me is really hard. Like,
Well, no, I think that I think definitely to be able to find rest in one another and to recognize your obligations towards the other person. Like this is what makes a happy marriage, a marriage where people really value one another and take a great deal of comfort in the relationship. I think divorces, on the other hand, are generally, and again, this is broad brush, right? But they're generally a function of one person feeling a burden that they think they can no longer bear,
yeah,
right?
that's a very good way to put it.
Yeah, and the idea is if you think about it in terms of burden or work on the one hand and rest on the other, there's a person who says, I no longer have any rest in this relationship, or I feel oppressed by this person. Whatever that looks like. But the idea is they feel like there is this great imbalance between who is at work, who feels the burdens, and who does not feel the burden. Because the moment you see yourself as the person who bears the ultimate burden, and then you look at the other person,
Sure.
as the person who has no burdens, then mentally you're accepting a pattern for breaking away. Like you're accepting a pattern for liberation, right? And so that's not the direction you want to go in, obviously, as a married person. But what you were talking about earlier, where people, look at the opposite sex as essentially embodying these characteristics as a presumption until they, find somebody who hopefully, doesn't meet their expectations, like exceeds them in a positive way. That's a difficult starting point, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, not to get it, not to. I apologize that we've sort of gone on this other route.
That's okay.
What I mean, do you have even like mental options for where we take it from here in a post-Christian world? Because as mentioned, it's like liberalism has reached it's reached its natural conclusion. It's eating itself. It's now just materialism galore. We have the freedom to do all these insane things. People are still unhappy. It's the complete atomization of each person in the name of freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, where do you I mean, what are like practical, actual
I don't
steps?
I don't know that I have practical steps, to be honest with you. I don't think people would take those steps until there was some crisis that forced them to.
Yes, I am in complete agreement on that.
Yeah, I think that for people to limit their options, to restrict their own freedom,
Yeah,
and to rebind themselves to others in some meaningful way, they're going to have to face some sort of alternative that is worse than
yep,
doing that. Because right now, there aren't really worse alternatives. I mean, I get that loneliness is hard and I get that people are struggling with meaning. But as long as you've still got a full belly and you can enjoy yourself,
yep,
it's real hard to overcome that.
yep.
I just think if you don't have the crisis situation, people will not take whatever steps that involve some sort of transformation of their social relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. So, and I think that there are other people who have given some thought to this questions with respect to, say, technology or something along those lines. Like Robin Phillips, I think, has done
Mhm.
this. Um, but I just feel like we're waiting for some sort of social transformation that we didn't ask for. You know?
Yeah, we're waiting for some situation where the dollar collapses, and which,
Yeah.
I mean, that's that one. It's not an if, it's a when.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
$40 trillion in debt. Like, we're never paying that thing off.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Forget it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Not gonna happen.
yeah.
Um,
Your retirement funds, your 401ks in the stock market. Yeah, those aren't going to survive the government defaulting on all that stuff.
yeah. Yeah. Most certainly.
And it's not an if the government defaults; it's a when.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
It's going to happen. I would bet dollars to in fact, I do bet dollars to donuts because I don't invest in the stock market. This could happen in my lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a sustainable
Yeah,
situation at
I
all.
think the numbers I heard are we bring in 4 trillion a year, we spend 6.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
spending 50% over what we bring in
Yeah.
every year.
So speaking of economics, I
Mhm.
wanna I wanna tie this back
Sure,
to part of the dynamic that I
please.
discussed a little bit earlier, right? So one of the things that we've seen historically with the practice of people becoming infinite possibility creatures economically,
Mhm,
right? When they become liberated from what we're seen or at least practiced as limits in the past. We see this in the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, Marx again, and I used to, I taught Marx in sociology of religion, so I have some familiarity with his works. When he analyzes industrial society, he's a really brilliant analyst. Obviously, his conclusions are off the table and have killed a lot of people, frankly, historically. But his analysis of what has happened and his discussion and his comparison of the bourgeois versus the proletariat is really eye-opening
mhm,
because he discusses the bourgeois as people who have a multiplication of means and of luxuries.
mhm,
So, in other words, they have more and more and more money, like quantity becomes the quality of money, he writes, right? So, they have more and more and more money, they have more and more and more luxuries. And
mhm,
so they become infinite possibility creatures according to this law of limitless production.
mhm,
Remember, if the law of limitlessness now becomes your natural law, if it is superimposed over the law in fact that would guide us towards theosis, and it becomes this sort of anthropological seed towards a whole new form of civilization, then economically you've got people who are now acting according to that law, right? And Max Weber goes a little bit in this direction in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Obviously he was a very intelligent man and does a great job. I would describe the situation a little bit differently along the lines that I've laid out here. The idea that you now have this ontology of limitless activity, this ontology of limitless work, right? And of limitless liberation. Okay. So the bourgeois embody that on the positive side. The proletariat become the underclass that suffer it. And remember how I've talked about bifurcation at various
mhm,
times, right? That you have a part of human nature that that embodies the law and that is oppressive, and then you've got the part of human nature that is beneath, that suffers it, that is, destined for liberation, the same way you have God the lawgiver and then you have Christ,
mhm,
right? Well, think about that bifurcation applying to modern industrial society where you have the oppressive class, who is the bourgeois, and then you have the oppressed class, who are the proles, who are the proletariat, right? And so, according to Marx's theory, and it plays right into the pattern here, the destiny of history is that the proletarians are going to have their revolution, right? They're going to overthrow the bourgeois, and then you're going to have a society of equality in which there is no more oppression, no more tyranny. But you see this bifurcation that happens when people become, or when they embody this law of limitless work, right, and of limitless liberation from the constraints of bodily reality. All right. Now, what I see, and again, I don't have a crystal ball,
mhm,
okay, but what I see in the predictions of folks in Silicon Valley or various economic analysts at this point when they talk about what's happening with artificial intelligence is that you are arguably going to have a digital repeat, a digital new version of this bifurcation. This is the possibility that I see taking shape out there, that you have a new overclass who have control of AI, whatever that amounts to. I mean, supposedly it does its own thing, right? And they can't explain it. But you have this new overclass that is tied together with AI and that benefits from it. And then you have an increasingly large underclass. We don't know exactly how large that underclass is going to be, but we've already seen layoffs at Oracle and layoffs just in the last week at Meta. That the one at Meta at least has something directly to do with AI per, comments you can find on the internet with people who are involved in these things. The one with Oracle, I'm not 100% sure, but they laid off like 30,000 people worldwide, right? And so you have these, you have companies like Meta that are, just definitive of the technological world that are already moving in this direction. And so if we have a new form of revolution, to put it in Marxist terms, we have a new form of the means of production, but the means of production now have to do with knowledge, right? As opposed to, making widgets or, whatever, right? It's now how knowledge is produced because we have a knowledge economy to a large extent in the modern West. So you have your overclass and your slowly creeping underclass, right? But if this happens, we will see yet another instance of what Mark Twain says, which is that history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme,
Yeah.
right? So you see a slightly different version of the same pattern. And why is that? It's because our pattern of salvation, way back in justification by faith alone, in my argument, has provided a kind of theological DNA for all of these different forms of modern experience. And I just want to make clear here, as I was working along this question, what does freedom mean? I never really intended to develop some sort of polemic against Protestantism or a polemic against Catholicism. It was never my goal. I just wanted to understand what is the character of modern experience? And why is it the way that it is? And in particular, again, why do we have all these machines that surround us when this was just not something that people had, 2,000 years ago? God didn't make the world with highways so that we could
Right.
invent the car and put it
Right.
on them, Um, but the criticism of Western religion, I think, is pretty clear, but it wasn't really directly intended. And so when we see what's happening with AI, in my mind, this is another expression or manifestation of this pattern of salvation that we are all bound up in until it collapses, until it reaches its end in some way, whatever that looks like. Um, and so you just see the same pattern forming. And I want to emphasize again, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not saying that it's going to be as bad as the Industrial Revolution or that it's going to be worse or whatever, but the fingerprints are there. And
Yeah.
so we're watching to see, how much damage actually occurs.
I'm one of the people who's not big on AI. I think it's mostly smoke and mirrors at this point.
Mhm.
They can't overcome the quantity versus quality
Mm.
problem. The AI is it's just whatever. Okay, it's a highly complex autocomplete. So
Yeah.
based on probabilities, it can't tell the difference between what's actually quality versus what's quantity. I have a feeling that we're going to run the economy into the ground even further,
Mhm.
pursuing a fantasy.
Well, what I've read
Mm,
is that the quality of AI that you deal with depends on the one hand with how much money you're willing to lay down for it. So if you want free AI, it's going to be not very good. It's going to come off as kind of basic. If you pay money for your AI, you're going to get a better product.
mhm.
So I've heard that on the one hand. I've also read, and this is by people who, journalists who went and did a story in Silicon Valley, that orders for AI have just increased exponentially in the
Mhm.
last 6 months. Like these companies are doing 50 or somewhere between 20 and 50% more orders per month
Mhm.
for their products, which means that companies are now buying them, which means that at some point you're going to hear about folks getting laid off. If they have computational type jobs, especially, I mean, I agree with you, you know, it's a pretty strong computational bent towards these things.
Yeah, if
But
we can
we
break it down to steps that are measured, then AI is going to take
and
over.
if you can produce a report that says here's the analysis of this information, right? But also, we've unfortunately lived in that world where we talk to computers when we call companies, and so customer service is going to be hit at some point, um, which is a large part of our economy. Really, I think it's large enough, I guess. Forms of customer service over the phone, you can see those go. But yeah, the economic situation, we'll see again what turns out with it or how it turns out. But but the historical patterns and the precedent that's been set, they point in a particular direction for it.
I have a friend who he worked in AI, and he said that he was driving down to I want to say it was California from Seattle, and got stuck in McDonald's. Was trying to explain to, or he was explaining that there was a woman there trying to explain what she wanted on her order, and the kiosk couldn't handle it. And his joke was that McDonald's needs human employees just to deal with McDonald's customers. was like, and I was like, well, yeah, of course. But he's like, no. He goes, I don't think you understand what I mean. Like the people that would eat at McDonald's are usually such incompetent people that you need a human there to just be like, oh, this person is not intelligent. Therefore, let me dumb this down. It wasn't like I can't figure that out. That was his funny point.
Yeah, well, I live in a rural. I go through rural enough areas that I've had to eat at Mickey D's occasionally. So it is what it is. You know, there's not many options. Just as what it is.
I'm one of these people who like the last time I ate McDonald's, I think was actually no, it was December of 2007. I was in the Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv.
Really?
Yeah, and they would not put cheese on the hamburger. And I point out numerous times that I'm, Christian, and they just said, "Yeah, we'll lose our kosher thing if
they put cheese on your burger."
Yeah, but they let me order a milkshake with it, but not have a piece of cheese even on the side. So a piece of cheese outside you can put on the burger. So with the milkshake, well, you give that to someone else. They have it all figured out. So if I want to give the slice of cheese to someone else, well, you won't.
Yeah.
There's all the things. Now you wrote this book here, which we have here, 1 John on Docetism and Resurrection. What exactly is Docetism?
Okay, so let me start by explaining the ancient doctrine or heresy of Docetism. Okay, because I think we have a modern version of Docetism. Not exactly the same thing, but close in some ways. So in the ancient heresy, you wouldn't start with Docetism, you'd actually start with Gnosticism. And Gnosticism says that the physical world is evil, that it is base and wicked. The spiritual world is good. So the world of the invisible, that's the world that is pristine and pure and you might say holy. And there is this great, vast disjuncture between the two. Okay. If you think about Gnostic salvation, it's essentially liberation from your body.
Correct.
In one point or another. But if you take this break between the spiritual and the physical and you apply it to Jesus Christ, well, Jesus Christ is God, which means he is spiritual. And if the spiritual can have no contact with the physical because it is base and wicked and evil, that means Christ can't have a body. And so Docetism is the heresy that Christ came but did not have a body. Instead, he only seemed to have a body or appeared to have a body. So the Greek word dokeo means to seem or to appear. So Docetism is like the seeming, right? Christ seemed to have a body. He didn't actually walk on the water physically. He didn't actually hang on the cross physically. The disciples thought he had a body, but he didn't. So I argue that there is a new form of Docetism, and this new form of Docetism works on two levels. Okay, there's a pretty simple sociological level, and then there's a more philosophical level, which I've sort of hinted at already. I mean, the discussion we had earlier about the automobile is actually an application of the form of Docetism, in my opinion. But let me step back and start with the simpler version. So the church is the body of Christ. Now, think about a physical body, and this is kind of a morbid analogy. I want to apologize a little bit for this.
Sure. Be morbid.
So when you think about what happens when a body dies, the material of the body, the physical material, does not go poof. It doesn't just disappear and there's no body anymore. Rather, what happens is that the spirit leaves and the body begins a process of breakdown. And so you have different chunks of flesh of larger or smaller size that are tending in the direction of the flesh becoming dust. Again, dust you are and to dust you shall return, right? When I look over the landscape of churches in the West, particularly since the Reformation, what I see with all of the different sects, with all of the different denominations, with people who say me, my Bible, and Jesus, even with people whose grandparents were Christian who now say I'm spiritual but not religious or whatever, pretty much anything other than people who are Muslims or occultists, which is where, the cutting edge seems to be going these days. But those folks who still have any kind of connection with Christianity and with the church, I see all of these different sects and denominations as pieces of a body that is in the process of breaking down. So here's one denomination and they got so many thousand members. And here's another denomination and they've got so many thousand members. Well, they seem to be doing okay. But really what they are is chunks of the flesh of the body of Christ that is in the process of breaking down, it's in the process of dissolution. And this, again, has happened over centuries. The church in Europe is not even a shadow of what it once was.
Yep.
The liberal Protestant churches in the United States have all but died. They used to be called mainline churches, which more and more that moniker is just a head scratcher because they're not the mainline to anything anymore. The only churches that even have some vibrancy are certain evangelical churches, which are losing members to non-denominational churches, which you can think of again as smaller pieces of flesh in the body of Christ, right? And you think to yourself, well, all of these other churches have declined. Eventually, the evangelicals are going to decline as well. I mean, if they're not already. And so what you have is a body that is in the process of breakdown. But if a body is in the process of breakdown, if it's in the process of dissolution, that means that it's already dead. That doesn't mean it's in the process of dying. That means the spirit has left and it is in the process of breaking down. And so if someone were to come to me and say, hold on, I go to church. There's a lot of well-meaning, good people in my church. We have vibrant worship. There's a lot of good things about my church. I would say, okay, sure, I see that, but that doesn't stop the historical trajectory that your church is a part of. It is part of breakdown. For the moment, it looks pretty good.
Yes.
For the moment, it looks okay.
The smoke machine is cranking.
Yeah, the smoke machine is cranking.
Did you hear that electric guitar riff?
Yeah. There are good things. There are good, well-meaning people in my church. Okay, I see that for now. Where are you going to be in 50 years?
No.
Because where was the Catholic Church in Europe 50 years ago, before Vatican II even, right? Where was the Catholic Church, a few hundred years ago? Where was the liberal Protestant church 100 years ago? Right? It's all a process of breakdown. And if you respond by saying, well, hold on a minute, like to be in the church, you just have to believe in Jesus, or to be in the church, you just have to hold certain doctrinal presuppositions. I would say, look, that's the fundamental form of docetism, is to say that it's a matter of spirit, not of body.
Yeah.
To say that it's not outward. If you draw that distinction sharply enough to say that all these different sects are justified, all these different churches are justified, anybody who, gets a new idea for how Christianity ought to be practiced and they go and they form their own non-denominational church, if you say that person is justified, then you're sacrificing the body of Christ to this form of heresy, in my opinion. And again, the people in the churches, I'm not trying to fault them or be overly critical. There are people who want to know the Lord, the people who want to live the Christian life. But there's a broader history here of which people tend to either not be aware or tend to dismiss, one or the other. And so when I look at this, I don't see branches of a different tree. Like I don't see branch theory that says, well, you got the Protestants, the Orthodox, and the Catholics, they're all branches in the same tree. And it has this sort of, harmonious view of the different churches. I think that view passes over historical difficulties. It passes over acrimony. It passes over pain. It passes over wars, like the wars of religion. In the 16th century, when atheists make or 17th century, when atheists make the argument that religion is violent or that religion causes wars, that's not a 20th century argument. That's a 17th century argument. But all of these things have happened. I can't look at the 30 Years' War in Germany and think, well, Protestants and Catholics are just going to be branches of the same tree at some point. Like, no, you can't do that when people are killed mercilessly.
Yep.
Like, you can't do that when entire towns are wiped out.
What was it? There was some number of, it was like a quarter of the people in Germany were killed during the 30 Years' War, or it was a third?
Yeah, the 30 Years' War was known prior to the 20th century. It was called the War of Total Destruction in Germany. That was the German.
What was the death toll on that one in terms of like percentage of population? It was like a quarter, a third.
I don't know, but it was high.
It was extremely
yeah,
bad.
it was very high. And so I can't look at the church and say with all of these various breakdowns and with the tendency towards things fracturing that we see in Western Christianity. I can't look at that and say, these are branches of the same church. I have such a hard time with that. I think it ignores so much pain and so much tragedy that's occurred in this history, not to mention so much presumption on the part of certain people to just leave. I mean, if you read, there's a great book, um, The Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch. It's a book about the Second Great Awakening, and it profiles the birth of various denominations and sects during this period. So you have the growth of the Baptists, you have the growth of the Methodists, the AME and the black churches really got their foothold during this period. The Mormons, Joseph Smith happened during this period. There were camp meetings happening on the Methodist side that were sort of like, religious precursors to Woodstock. And
Shit.
yeah. There's this really great, okay, this is a little bit tangential, but I need to mention this. There was this preacher in the Methodist camp called Lorenzo Dow, who was this really provocative figure. And he's one of these really quick-witted guys, excellent preacher. Protestants are great but historically they produce these really wonderful, great preachers. So anyway, in terms of their vocal talent. So he was asked about Calvinism. So he was not a Calvinist, right? And he said, Calvinism, I'll tell you what Calvinism is. Calvinism is you can and you can't, you will and you won't. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. That is Calvinism, right? And you just think, ow, zinger,
What I mean, what was that? What was that like? Though? I mean, like when you came to this realization that these are really just chunks of rotting flesh off of this body. It's like it's not. I mean, did you come to that realization slowly, or did it just hit you one day and you're like, oh?
Part of it had been with me for a long time, because before I went to graduate school and when I was in the Army, I went to church every week, right? I've always been devout, and I was still in the PCA at this point. And really good friend of mine, a man that I respect, was a pastor in the PCA church I was going to. And it really hit me. It hit me hard that I felt closer to the men and women in uniform in my unit than I did to the people I went to church with. And this was bothersome to me for several years. I just thought, okay, I'm in the Army now. This is a temporary thing. I never really had a plan to do it for a career, and I didn't. And so I saw it as like just sort of a passing stage, And I thought, I'm a Christian, and I've been this always, and God willing, I'm always going to be this. And it's far more definitive for how I see myself and my own sort of, self-identification or whatever. So why is it, if I see myself this strongly as a Christian and secondarily as a soldier, that I feel much closer to my fellow soldiers than I do to the people I go to church with? Why is it that my just sort of gut urges and instincts is to defend those people in uniform and not the people I go to church with? And I mean, there's all kind of social factors that I suppose you could throw in as an explanation to that, but it was always bothersome to me. This is before my daughter was born. And, it's before I went to combat. I just thought there's something broken. Why is there not some level of obligation that I feel towards these folks? Like I could pick up and leave this church at any time. Now I was like a pretty, well-entrenched Calvinist. So I wasn't gonna get up and leave those churches or leave a Presbyterian church for no reason, but I could, people came and went, and so that was definitely part of it. Definitely part of it.
The second part of Docetism, what is it?
Okay, so the second part of Docetism is more theological. It's not just looking out at the landscape of the Christian church in the West and how do you interpret that landscape. It has to do with forms of salvation and the general form of the spiritual life, not only as it's carried, say, in an individual, but also as it might be carried in a society. Okay, so let's start with the patristic example, and I'll start with the Orthodox example, although I don't think that it's fundamentally different from what you see in somebody like St. Augustine. I'm sure there are patristic scholars who will, needle me on that. But in any case,
There's a lot to know out there. It's
yeah,
impossible for
yeah,
one person to know even a
sure,
fraction of it.
sure. So think about theosis as a movement towards union with God. Embedded within that movement is a cycle of trying to be obedient to the law, failing inevitably, uh, going after you have failed. And the law is merciful and good in all of this. Okay, the law is not is not a tyrant. It's not oppressive. It shows us our sin and doesn't save us, like St. Paul says, right? But it's also not, like I'm saying, oppressive, which St. Paul does not say anywhere that the law is oppressive or a tyrant, right? So you fail, then you go to the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is where you rest in God's mercy. So it's work and there's rest, right? You work underneath the law. That's our striving. We fail. We then rest in God's mercy. And God's mercy and the grace that he gives us to be more obedient is really the fundamental piece of salvation. You know, faith and works are seen as a higher and lower. If you look at the scripture, it's rare, in my opinion, that you see dualisms in the sort of Protestant fashion. What you see is greater and lesser, higher and lower, right?
There's a lot of complementary.
Right.
It's the harmony. It's the in rest in one another.
Right. But like, just for example, if you go to Matthew 23, where Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees, their fundamental problem is that they mistake higher and lower. You see it over and over again. They mistake the higher for the lower. Like, why do you clean the outside and not the inside? Clean the inside first, then clean the outside. Why? Because the inside is higher, the outside is lower. It's not bad to clean the outside, but you
Yeah.
got to clean the inside first. Like, no, have your priorities rightly aligned.
It's not wrong to pay tithes on mint and cumin.
Right.
So they do that, and then they forget the weight.
Exactly.
It's the weightier matters of the law.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Higher and lower. You got to have that understood. Go back and read Matthew 23 when you get a moment. I encourage you, and just say, okay, where is the confusion between greater and lesser? So
it's the resting, the complementary, the greater, lesser.
Well,
they work with each other.
In this case, our work is the lesser, God's grace and faith is the greater, like by far the greater, right? So you go to the Eucharist, and the Eucharist gives you, forgiveness of sins and grace to be hopefully more obedient next time, right? Not to commit the same sins or to make progress in your struggle. And ideally, through this cycle, you move closer to theosis, right? You actually get more holy. You actually look a little bit more like the saints, hopefully, right? And so over the course of a lifetime, there is this progress, and it moves in this cyclical kind of pattern. So in the second form of docetism, as I've hinted at, if not explained a little bit earlier, the form of the law changes. And this changes as a result of developments in canon law over the medieval period in the Western Church. From about 1100 up to 1500, there is a vast expansion in the study of law, the number of laws, all of the canons that are compiled, systematized, harmonized. The law takes on a fundamentally different shape, particularly between 1100 and 1300. Okay, you've got this just exponential growth in the law. The Fourth Lateran Council, establishes many of these laws, like it makes them official. Basically, Innocent III, who is probably the most powerful medieval pope, is the one who oversees this council. So it's important to note that in this vast expansion of the law and this systematizing of the law, Harold Berman, who is a historical scholar of law from Harvard, he says that the law becomes something that develops organically, right? And we're talking about canon law, right? So canon law at this point did not differentiate sharply between, say, the law that sets the jurisdiction between kings and popes on the one hand, or say economic law on the other hand, or marriage law or moral law. There's just the law, right? We have all these distinctions. These are kind of 20th and 21st century ways of separating things. They weren't there to nearly the same extent, if at all, in the 1100s and the 1200s. Okay, so imagine that law and its tendency towards systematization pressed onto the Christian in its requirement of their obedience, and when they go to confession, the requirement that they confess all of their sins. This is actually what happened, okay? And there's this really wonderful short little article by James McHugh, another historian, and it's called Simul Justus et Peccator in Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther, okay? And so he's taking that doctrine, justified and sinner, at the same time and comparing it in these different figures. But one of the things that he notes that's really important is that around the year 1300 is when the problem of the anxious conscience develops among
Oh.
Western Christians, particularly the monks. When I say Western Christians, I'm thinking more of the monks, okay? So the problem of the anxious or burdened conscience in confession, they start to see it show up around that time. It's 200 years before Luther, right? But the idea is if you're going to be one of the religious virtuosos, the monks who are seeking salvation, then when you go to confession, you have to confess absolutely every sin. And remember, the law is comprehensive and exact at this point, right? You've got all of these decretals, which are these sort of vast compilations and comparisons of laws that start in the 1100s. Okay, Gratian's Decretum is the most well-known of them. And so you've got these vast collections of laws. They begin to impact the spiritual life, but the impact of a universal and systematized and at the same time very precise law on the conscience of someone who's actually trying to follow it on the way to salvation is anxiety.
Yeah.
Like it becomes really, really troubling, right? And so by the time you get to Luther in 1500, Luther sees the law as a tyrant. The law has become this oppressive thing. The law has become an enormous burden. And again, it's not just for Luther. When you shift to Calvin, and I really haven't talked at all about Calvin here, but for Calvin, it's not so much the law as it is the character of God as judge. But you can see that those two things are tied together pretty closely, right? So I don't want to go too deep down that path.
Well,
But
also Luther struggled with scrupulosity
yes, he did. I mean,
at
there's
extreme levels.
when I asked where Luther came from, and again, this is all uh, with me reading Freedom of a Christian and thinking, okay, where does this come from?
Mhm.
Like, how does this happen? Yeah, Luther certainly had his own personal proclivities and personal, his personality quirks, I guess. But if you take away the law, I don't understand how Luther gets where he gets. Like, the law is the main uh, adversary, you might say, the main challenge that Luther faces in his spiritual life, right? So you have the law of the Pharaoh, I would call it. That's what the canon law has become, what the law of God has become, essentially, right? You have this law of the Pharaoh, and it's pressing down upon its adherents. And so Luther's light bulb moment, his tower moment, the scholars call it, because he supposedly had it in the Tower of Wittenberg, is when he sees that you can be saved by faith alone. You turn entirely from the law to the grace of Christ. But at this point, because the nature of the law has changed, the nature of grace has changed also. Right? Grace is not, I'm saying, my nature is fallen. I'm not obedient. Heal me from my sins and give me grace to follow the law. While Luther might describe grace in those terms, it's also fundamentally liberation from the law's terror, liberation from the law's curse. And so it is freedom from the law. Remember, Christ takes on the law now, not the believer. Like there's this vast, anxiety-inducing burden. Christ is the one who takes this on. The believer is free. And this is a different kind of experience than what you see in St. Augustine. It's a different kind of experience than anything you'll see in the fathers, right? In the Eastern fathers. So what you have is the tyrannical law, and then you have liberation from that law. Now, at this point, a good Lutheran will look at me and say, "You're not being quite fair. Lutherans are not antinomians. They do believe in morality. In fact, some of them are quite moral. I would say most of them are quite moral. I'm not trying to say they're immoral people or anything.
No, many
Not,
Lutherans, very good people.
I'm not trying to say that at all. And they would say, well, look, Luther says after you experience the grace of Christ, you return to the law with its power to terrify being taken away, and so now you can obey it joyfully, right? And this is very close to what something like St. Augustine would say, which is that the law inspired fear, but then he experienced grace. Now the law inspires love, right? And so Luther follows in these um, Augustinian footsteps, at least as far as his own understanding of this is concerned. But here's the thing. Luther cannot wave his hand and undo hundreds of years of legal development. Right? The law does not change its character as a tyrant. Okay? So let's say, and this is kind of hypothetical, right? The Lutheran comes under the law as a tyrant and an oppressor, right? And it pushes him to give up all of his hope in obedience and all of his hope in the law as a means of salvation. So he goes to Christ and he's liberated. The conscience is liberated. Now there's freedom, right? And so after that, he can look back at the law and say, you can't terrify me anymore. I can be obedient to you and be joyful about it. But the law is still the law.
Yeah.
It's still an oppressor and a tyrant in its form, right? It's still on the other side of all of this systematization and harmonization and 200 years of anxiety, the anxious conscience of the Catholic monks. All of this has already happened. And so the law will reassert itself in those terms. And when the Christian goes to the Eucharist, say the second time, because we're thinking in terms of cycles here, right? It's again liberation from the law, which is trying its best to terrify him, and which is in fact the form of something terrifying. Something, and I make the argument in an article in Analogia Journal that the canon law is the precursor to modern totalitarian law, right? That they bear certain characteristics. If you read Hannah Arendt on the origins of totalitarianism, her description of the law sounds a whole lot like Luther's description of the Christian under canon law. And there's a lot of similarities there. Okay. So that's the argument that I make. But imagine a cycle of coming under the law of the Pharaoh and liberation, and then eventually coming under the law of the Pharaoh again, and then liberation. The Lutheran would say, and Luther would say, look, we're not negating the law per se. We're just negating its power to terrify. But how many times can you negate the law's power to terrify before you're just negating the law?
Yeah.
Before you're just saying, I don't need to be obedient to this thing anymore.
Absolutely.
It can do nothing to me. And this is not an intended consequence, okay? Not an intended consequence. But it's a cyclical thing. It's a cycle of liberation. Think about the modern world as cycles of liberation. And think about it as a pattern that's not just there in a particular form of spiritual life, but is also there in a particular form of social organization, right? So how does liberation happen? Not all at once, right? First, you're liberated from kings. Then after the liberation from kings in the Revolutionary era, you're liberated in some parts of the West from the totalitarian state, right? But the progress is towards liberation from the state per se.
Correct.
Right? Which is arguably, I think there's an argument that that's where we are, right? That you're liberated from various forms of power until those forms of power just cannot assert themselves over you. Now, they try all new kinds of forms of infinity in order to be able to assert themselves, like the surveillance state,
right,
or something along those lines, which is where we are, we seem to be moving. China's definitely there, right? And if you think about social forms of liberation, well, what is, or philosophical forms, I'm not the one to say this, but if you think about existentialist philosophy, it's basically the white man's liberation, right? And so all the forms of liberationism that come after it, after you've liberated the white man, by the time you get to the 60s and the 70s, you have liberation of African Americans, you have liberation of women. Now we have sexual liberation. Liberation moves in cycles. When I say now we have sexual liberation, I mean the events of, just the last 10 years with transgenderism and Obergefell and
the liberation from gender.
Right. So yeah, Judith Butler came, and now we all understand the world. Right. Yeah. So in any case, so there are these cycles of liberation, right? And so just as there is a cycle in which an oppressive law is met, and there's liberation from that law, and then it would eventually reassert itself, and then there's liberation again in this sort of cycle of justification by faith alone. You can see a social manifestation of that through modern history. Now, part and parcel of this is the idea that there, as I've expressed before, is the idea that there is a bifurcation, right? There's an oppressive part. There's a part that's totally at rest and is also, generally speaking, the oppressive part. And then there's a part that's totally at work, right? And this is a little bit easier to see in some instances than others, I will admit. I think the Industrial Revolution is probably the easiest one, right? Where you have those who are totally at rest being the bourgeois, and then you have those who are totally at work and totally under burden, which would be the proletariat. But I think there's an even broader implication. So, for example, if you think about our relation with the natural world, in my opinion, God created us so that there would be a balance of work and rest between one another and nature, right? So the natural world, we're supposed to have a balance of work and rest with it. And this is why God creates us. What happens with this form of salvation in which we now live, this form of salvation that began in the Catholic medieval world, has a turning point in the Reformation, and has moved into the secular modern world. Okay, I really just see Protestantism as kind of a way station here. Like, it's not the end game, What has happened is that that balance has been replaced with an element of total rest and an element of total work.
Mm.
So, for example, think about our attitude towards the natural world
Mhm.
and towards, say, industrial farming
Mhm.
or
Right.
something like that. Like industrial farming is a total burden placed on the natural world, in my
Yeah, it's
opinion.
it's it's what's the term? We have just one species of like we just plant hundreds of acres of potatoes with no
Hmm.
diversity, and what do you describe it? Forget the word, but yeah.
Yeah, but the idea is that the natural world is essentially raw material, and that it is there to be exploited to the maximum degree possible. And we have fertilizers and agricultural like universities that study how we can maximize production. But imagine us, because we want to be able to have tomatoes any time of the year, or to have, say an infinite amount of corn for corn syrup, for plastic, for whatever else. We are just fine applying an infinite burden to the natural world
Mhm.
so that we may be totally at rest in the sense of eating food without ever lifting our finger to do it, because we have industrial processes. And again, having food out of season, and an infinite variety at whatever time we want. But the price of that is a lack of balance with the natural world. Okay, the price of that is that it has to work without rest. Strikingly, in Leviticus, I can't quote chapter and verse, but in Leviticus, the earth is supposed to rest every 7 years, right? I don't know to what extent the Israelites practice that, but at least in theory, it is there. If God sees his people as part of the natural world, and everything is supposed to rest because rest is holy, everything participates in it, which means that the burdens of all, or the burdens are never to fall oppressively on the shoulders of any one part of the natural world, including the land, right? And so rather than living in that balance, we live in the imbalance of total work and total rest. That is the dynamic that we find ourselves in.
You're reminding me now, and I have this book somewhere. I was just looking for it. Here it is. Jesus and the Jubilee.
Oh, okay.
You know
Yeah,
John Bergsma?
I've heard of Bergsma,
Yeah, he's a
but
Catholic
yeah.
writer, biblical scholar,
Hmm.
and he wrote his dissertation on the Jubilee.
Okay.
And
Nice.
he's really into this thing about it. Just suddenly occurred to me about rest,
Yeah, yeah.
how important this is. And it's
Hmm.
what is a Jubilee? It's 7 times 7. It's on the 50th year.
50th year, yeah.
Right. So the 7 sevens, seven
Yeah.
sevens complete you have a year. And
Hmm.
see everything has to life out. You just reminded me very much of that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden about everything working in harmony,
Hmm.
things returning to the natural order.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
continue.
So that, I think, is, that's part of the philosophical idea of the new docetism. Now, the reason that I call it docetism
Mhm.
is, again, that there's a Christ here, right? And this Christ, in my opinion, is a fundamentally misconstrued understanding of Christ,
Mhm.
right? It's always struck me that we look at the modern world, and there's a lot of apostasy, and there's a lot of movement away from God. And yet we don't have a really concrete idea of any form of idolatry that's at the heart of it. But what if there were a Christ who instead of gathered was part and parcel of a dynamic of scattering? Like, what if you had a Christ that actually helped things break apart as
Oh,
opposed to helping things be gathered together,
huh,
right? So that's a form of idolatry that's ontological,
okay.
right? And so, in the book, I talk a lot about what I call the Christ idol, which is the idea that you have this Christ who is part of a process that turns things upside down. And this, I think, really resonates with the story of the golden calf,
Uh-huh.
because the Israelites thought the golden calf was Yahweh who had led them out of Egypt. They didn't think it was a different God. And
Mhm.
so, this paradigmatic instance of idolatry is not, hey, you believe in Yahweh and this other God, or this other God instead of
Oh,
Yahweh. It's, you believe in Yahweh, but you believe in him in the wrong way.
I see.
You see what I mean? So the idolatry is to believe in the right God in the wrong way,
I see.
all right? Or the right God with the wrong implications.
I
And
see.
what is so subtle, what is so incredibly subtle about this form of idolatry is that you can assent, you can ascribe to all of the ancient councils. Well, pretty much all of the ancient councils. All the Protestants don't do that. But you can ascribe to the ancient creeds. You can ascribe to the Nicene Creed, right? You can ascribe to the Chalcedonian Creed. You can have a love of the fathers and of the patristics, right? You can proclaim to have, you can say you're going to have this, but this form of idolatry is very, very subtle. Like it works over centuries. And I think we can really only see it here at what I think of as the end of the process. Like you can look back over however many hundreds of years and say, okay, things have been breaking down for a long time. How have they been doing this? And they've been doing it in the name of Christ to some extent, right? The same way that, when the body of Christ breaks down and when there are schisms, very often it is because of people who said, I have this experience of grace, now come and follow me, right? Or I'm seeking an experience of grace, now come and follow me, whether it's Ann Hutchins. Well, Ann Hutchinson didn't seek followers, but like Roger Williams, I'm just going to keep breaking away until I'm with, the pure people, which is me and my wife.
Who's Roger Williams?
Roger Williams is a Puritan era figure
I see.
who got kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, went to Rhode. He founded Rhode Island. But he just sort of kept the sort of thumbnail sketch of him is that he just kept breaking away from people because he wanted a more pure church. Okay. So if that's a little off historically, forgive me for that.
I know very little about Protestantism.
Yeah.
My main interest is like 600 BC to like 600 AD in the Mediterranean.
Gotcha.
That's So I mean, when people mention like, I'm kind of like I'm aware of like Billy Graham. I'm aware of like, well, there were Puritans, but it's just, it doesn't really it's not my area of interest.
Yeah. Well, in the First Great Awakening, just to give you a good example of it,
that was what, mid 1800s?
No, this is 1700 to 1740 to 1745, give or take.
So there you go. Like, I really don't know American Protestants.
I think the generation before the Revolution.
Okay.
That's basically what it is.
Okay. When was the Second Great Awakening?
1790 to 1830, give or take.
Was there a third one?
No. I don't think. I mean, I've studied American religious history. I don't recall a third American Great Awakening.
Yeah, well, you know much more than I do about this. But
well, what happened in the 60s after the world wars was a sort of secular awakening, in my opinion, a secularized version of things that had come earlier. But in any case, in the First Great Awakening, people wanted an experience of grace. The way they sought it was by employing a tactic called preaching terrors. Does that sound a little bit like Luther? Now, these were Calvinists who were doing it, so they were doing the Calvinist version. But Jonathan Edwards wrote a sermon called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God.
About the spider above the fire.
Yeah. But this was the same period. Jonathan Edwards lived through the First Great Awakening. And because of people who were seeking this experience, or people who, there were pastors who had this experience, and they thought that it authorized them to go into other people's jurisdictions and start preaching.
Oh.
And there's one pastor named Gilbert Tennant. He preached a sermon called "The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry." The idea being that, like, if you've got a preacher and they haven't had this experience of grace in the heart, a la Luther and Calvin, maybe you should find, maybe you should look somewhere else. You should have second thoughts at the very least, right? Yeah. But the idea is that this experience of grace breaks the church apart, as opposed to solidifying and strengthening and edifying the body of Christ. What you've got is something that divides congregations. And this was really shocking to Tennant, by the way, when he started his part in what would be the First Great Awakening, what it would become. He thought, we're going to spread this experience of grace and it will make people more moral. He thought, we're going to have a kind of moral reformation here. Society will get better. And then a year or two later, after the schism had happened, he looked back and he was just like, what went wrong here? This is not what we expected. But the thing is, if you are walking along a path of division or liberation under the impression that it is a path of salvation, then you don't know where you're going. And so after the break happens and after the pain happens, you look back and you say, where did we go wrong? Sort of like in a secular sense, well, after Marx, we were going to create a perfect society. We were going to create this utopia. And instead we created hell on earth for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right? And so there are these similarities that seem disparate on the surface, but I would argue that there are these different examples that seem disparate on the surface, but I would argue that there's a pattern underlying them that manifests itself one way here, one way there. But it's still the same pattern, like in some very fundamental ways. Mm-hmm. So the second version of the New Docetism, again, more theological, has to do with the idea of salvation as something that breaks things apart, and it has to do with the centrality of Christ. So it's not just like looking out at the church and saying, how can we say Christ has a body when it's broken into all these pieces? That's the sort of sociological interpretation. But the one that's more apt to be described in terms of philosophical theology has to do with the ontological meaning of Christ. Like, does he break things down according to this pattern, or does he gather them like we see in Ephesians? He's going to gather all things under his headship, right? But yeah.
Wow. Where do you see Docetism? Do you see Docetism as existing in the secular world right now?
Oh yeah, sure.
Where would
Sure.
be like the one or two, like a few sentences each? Let's say the top 3 places that you see it.
Well, we've talked about artificial intelligence as a possible, bifurcation along the lines of the Industrial Revolution, where you have an upper class and a lower class. I think definitely there. I think.
Well, I mean, like as a religious, like
Oh, it's
philosophical form.
I don't know that we see it as an explicitly religious form.
Mhm.
I think the nature of Docetism is to move away from Christianity and to ultimately reject Christianity, because you're talking about something. One of its targets, one of the things that it eradicates, is rest in God, right? So that means a move away from Christianity and a move away from the Christian God. That doesn't necessarily mean a total move. It doesn't mean that it's ever going to be the case that there's just no churches anywhere.
Right.
I don't know that I see that happening. But I think that by and large, the social order has moved through the religious aspect of this, especially since the 1960s and this latest cycle that we've been in. I see it as less an overtly religious phenomenon and more a social phenomenon. But in my mind, there's a certain ontological pattern that is moving in a particular direction. It moves through churches. It has moved through churches in the past. Now it's in the secular world.
Wow.
And that idea, by the way, is not necessarily original with me. I mean, there are other sociologists who say, hey, something's going on here. And Protestantism's kind of in the middle, but it's moving towards the secular world. Robert Bellah is a 20th century social scientist, and he's actually my teacher's teacher.
Oh.
And he said something similar. So for me to say something like that, I mean, it's not really an original idea, but I agreed when I saw it with him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Being that you have to drive back to California, we have limited time. What would you like to close with?
These are the ideas that drove me to orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't Orthodox when I started this study,
Mm-hmm.
and when I started dedicating years to these questions, but they are the ones that moved me there. And I think the Orthodox Church is the only church that has not suffered these particular patterns or been a part of them.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there have been schisms in the Orthodox Church, but the difference is that the schisms heal.
Right.
Generally speaking, right? Like they, within the communion, there can be a schism, but it comes back together. As a general thing in the Orthodox world. There has not been this process of continual breakdown. And that's got so much to do with why I am Orthodox, is that I saw these problems, and at some point I just came to the realization, like, these are just not compatible with the Christian faith as I understand it. And so I ended up in the Orthodox Church. And I think God is present in the Orthodox Church in a very real way. People are fallen, communities struggle. So you're not going to walk in and see a whole bunch of perfect people. It's a hospital for sinners. I mean, it really is a hospital for sinners.
It's a sick ward.
Yeah, it's a sick ward. But God is there. He is very much there. And I would encourage anybody to go to a service and to learn to pray. Learn to pray. It takes time, but do it. It's worth it.
What would be books that you would recommend to people who maybe they're looking into the church? Maybe they're people who they've been in the church for, say, like a year, and they go, well, I've read a few books. What would be, say, like 5 books that you go, these are good books just to get you squared away with prayer?
Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives is good.
Phenomenal book. I have right here. Excellent book.
Yeah, Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives is quite good. The Orthodox Way by Timothy Ware is pretty good. by Callistos Ware.
Got that one. But on prayer
Uh,
specifically.
For those who have been Orthodox for a while, okay, not for folks who are brand new, I would read The Art of Prayer. That has been the most transformative book for me.
Art of Prayer, who writes that one?
It's a compilation. Saint Theophan the Recluse is probably the main contributor. But so it's a book that's written for monks. So it's not a beginner book. But
I think the beginner book that introduces you to Saint Theophan's The Path of Prayer.
okay.
I think that, and then once I mean, I've not read The Art of Prayer, but now that you mention, I have seen quotations from it.
If you've been Orthodox for 5 or 10 years and you're wanting to learn the prayer of the heart, go to The Art of Prayer.
Excellent.
Under the guidance of your priest or spiritual father.
Okay.
But The Art of Prayer, yeah. Anything by Saint Ignatius Branchaninov is good. I am also definitely a fan of Saint John of Kronstadt. I would recommend him for beginners as well. Saint John of Kronstadt is quite good. My Life in Christ is it helps.
I've never read that. I've just heard it's a phenomenal book. Everyone I know has read it, said you got to read this book.
Yeah, it's quite good. Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, it's time. You know, I got to read this book now.
I think God was speaking to him when he wrote. I just think God gives certain saints the words, and I think he's one of them. So yeah, that's where I would go. I'm not sure if that's 5, but that's where I would go.
It's phenomenal, but I'm surprised I had 3 of them.
Yeah.
I mean, and what would you say to people who struggle with prayer?
What would I say to people who struggle with prayer?
People who go, I go to prayer. It's just, like I don't feel anything.
I don't feel anything.
Yeah,
I would say
I don't feel anything.
I would say ask God to help you to focus. I would say read a couple of Psalms before you begin to pray. I would say when you wake up in the day, drink holy water.
Oh, okay.
Take a sip. First thing you do in the day. I would say those things. I think it's hard to say something just for everybody because people are in different places, But I would also say prayer is work. There are forces that don't want you to pray. So the fact that it's hard shouldn't stop you, It's just, it's going to be a struggle. We love talking about struggle in the Orthodox Church. So it's going to be a struggle. Don't let that get you down.
Or perhaps stopping and thinking of all the things you're grateful for before you pray.
Yes. I spun my wheels with prayer for years. I didn't do it right. Much like my patron saint actually is Saint Pachomius. And
oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
how did you choose Saint Pachomius?
You mean how did he choose me?
Oh, okay.
There was a book when I was in grad school. There was a book that was just put out that I passed every day, and I eventually picked it up and read it. And
what was the name of it?
It was a study of him, just Pachomius. I think it was like father of father of the ancient saints or something, one of the ancient monastics, because he's one of the original founders of communal monasticism.
Correct. Yes.
So so he was a soldier before he converted. Mm-hmm. He had a big emphasis on mercy, which which definitely drew me. But he converts after he leaves the Roman army. He was conscripted into the Roman army, like as a slave. He was forced to fight.
Oh, wow.
Then he got out after they helped put down a rebellion. He gets out after it's over. And so he gets baptized, and then he just sort of goes off into the wilderness by himself. Like he's going to figure this all out on his own. Yeah. Right. So, and he spends a couple of years, and then he's like, evidently he just wasn't getting it, like it just wasn't going right. And so he goes back and he gets a teacher. And I basically did the same. Well, not exactly the same thing, obviously, but like I started as a Protestant, and I just thought, well, I can do the Jesus prayer. I can do this. I can do that. I had nobody telling me what to do. Yeah. And then after 2 or 3 years, I was just like, this is not working at all. I'm not even sure really what I'm doing because I just didn't have adequate instruction at the time.
Being a practitioner of the Jesus prayer, what are some books that you would recommend? Like 2 or 3 books that really helped you out with it, aside from The Art of Prayer.
Oh, The Art of Prayer was definitely the main one. Mm-hmm. Definitely, because it talks about the prayer of the mind and the heart over and over and over again. Like it's completely repetitive and yet very, very helpful. It's the kind of book that you sit down and read, and 10 minutes later, you just want to pray.
Wow.
You want to put the book up and you want to pray because you're like, okay, instead of reading about doing this, I'm going to go do it.
Wow.
By God's grace. Like that was my experience of it. And not everybody gets that. Not everybody gets that effect with it. And again, I would, especially if I was new, if I had only been Orthodox for 5 years or less, I would go to my priest and I'd be like, "Hey, do you think this book is good for me? Because if it's not, you know, let it go." Because it's not for everybody to be reading books that are kind of designed for monks.
Yeah.
But in any case, yeah, The Art of Prayer was definitely the book for me. After that, probably St. John of Kronstadt, actually, because he'll say things about prayer every so often, like to have this disposition or to pray with, like, there are words you can pull out of St. John that you can put in your own prayers that are so effective,
Oh,
just so
wonderful.
much better. And I love the way the church has better words than we do for the stuff we're going
Yeah,
through
right.
and the things that we need.
Right.
Like we don't have to figure out how to say it on our own. Not that it's bad to speak from your heart. I mean, it's good to do that. But like if you're struggling with something, whatever the sin is, sometimes the church just has the best words for it.
Absolutely.
Like far, far better than what I could come up with.
Look at something like, for example, like there was a prayer I read recently for the soul of a child who died.
Yeah.
And you read that prayer and you go, I never would have thought of something that touching,
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the
something
prayers are
that
amazing.
comforting, that touching. I came across it in a prayer book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Just thumbing through the different prayers.
Yeah. Some of the prayers are just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would say, prayer is a struggle.
Mm.
You're going to have to force yourself a little bit, and ask for God to help you. Like before you pray, just ask for grace in the prayer. I just think like God is there. Your guardian angel is there. Your patron saint is there. Like they all want you to turn to God, right? God is there. He wants to be near to us. One of the best things that I've heard that has stuck with me is a priest preaching a sermon once. He was talking about God's judgment. And coming out of a Calvinist context, this was especially striking. He said, God does not judge looking for our sins so that he can condemn us. He looks for the good things so that he can turn to us. That is his judgment. And so when you come to pray, if it's a struggle, God's going to see your struggle. And eventually he will turn to you, even if you don't feel it immediately, because you won't feel it immediately, I wouldn't think, but just keep on, don't give up.
It's also like the ruler of the synagogue. What does he say? He says, I believe, help my unbelief. So that's a very good
Yeah.
prayer right there. I believe, help my unbelief.
Yeah. It's a very good prayer.
Sometimes you don't know what to pray for. We don't know what to pray for.
Yeah.
And so we have to pray for fervor. We have to pray. Sometimes we have to pray that God will help us to pray.
Yeah. Yes, very much. I think definitely seek help, definitely seek help.
And it's very sad when I see people go, well, I've just read the books on the prayers that didn't do anything. I was like, but do you actually like try and experience those prayers in some way? Do you try and make them real in your life? Do you stop before you pray and like stop, sit in silence for 2 minutes, 3 minutes?
St. John of Kronstadt says, if you're going to say prayers, you don't rush through them. You say them slowly. Like, focus on the words. He talks a lot about feeling the words, which
it's the same here with the path of prayer.
Yeah. Feel the words, say them slowly. It doesn't matter if you say the Jesus prayer, it does not matter how many times you say it.
Right.
It matters that you are still in the presence of God.
Right.
Like the words are, I don't want to just say, well, the words are secondary. It's not necessarily that.
Right.
Like you have to say them
Right.
and you have to feel them. But like the idea, like when I first started, I was like, okay, I'm gonna say Jesus prayer 40 times, or I'm gonna go around my prayer rope once or twice. I'm like, that's good. Then I'm good. Like I was literally doing that. And it wasn't until years after that I just figured like, okay, that's not at all what you're doing. Like you're not counting anything. My spiritual father prefers not using a prayer rope,
Yeah, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever.
Yeah. However long it takes, just, focus on humility before God, on his presence, the fact that he loves us. It's like see your own sin to the greatest extent that you can. Forget about the sins of others. Forget about the stuff that is bothering you. Cast aside all worldly cares, like we say in the liturgy, right?
You come back to it later.
Yeah, you come back to it later. You think about that stuff later. Now you're going to set aside everything and you're just going to dwell in the presence of God,
What would you say? I mean, the way of the pilgrim, speaking of the prayer of the heart, what effect has that had on you in terms of a book about praying, or was it just very secondary? Because I know some people go, it helped, but it was a nice jumping off point. I've met other people who are like, I read it and boom, it just right away just set me off.
I read it after going through the Art of Prayer, and so I read it, and my impression was like, okay, this guy really gets it, and like he also like I was like he really like he really gets it, and this is really good.
Yeah.
I like the fact that it was a story and it wasn't quite so instructional,
Yeah.
you know? But there were times when he talks about the mind going down into the heart, and there are times where he talks about, the feeling of the spirit of prayer coming upon
Uh-huh.
him. I was just like, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. Yeah, that is really good stuff because, yeah, I mean, I don't, sorry, I'm not being very articulate here, but it was very good. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
What I find so intriguing about it is that no one has any clue who wrote it.
Yeah.
No
Yeah,
one
yeah.
has a clue who wrote it.
Mhm.
It's not even clear, like, even rough. I mean, it was like, what, like mid-1800s, I think?
Yeah. Well, St. Joseph, the Hesychast recommends it. So, it's hard to go wrong. Hard to go wrong there. St. Joseph was a pretty hardcore guy.
Yeah.
And he recommends it.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how many of those, like, great saints on Athos, they were very much, like, in tune with, like, Russian spirituality.
Mhm.
You think, well, it's very ethnic. It's like, no, they were reading all these other writings,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So, well,
Oh,
anyway, it's been a pleasure to have you on. I'm so happy I've had you on and been able to talk with you. And I really enjoyed our discussion, not only about your book and your studies, but about prayer.
yeah.
I enjoyed having lunch with you tremendously.
Thank you. I really enjoyed coming here. Your hospitality has been really outstanding.
You're too
Really
kind.
appreciate it.
You're too kind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Wonderful.